The Incoherence of the Incoherence by Averroes. This is just a brief summary of the basic ideas. Averroes, 1126 till 1198 AD. The principal ideas are that since any series of causes necessary through another cause must ultimately depend upon a cause necessary in itself, a first cause, God, as the first cause, exists. God did not create the world in time, either by willing it at the moment of creation or by willing it eternally. For to act in time is to change, and God is changeless because he is perfect. God, as first cause, an unmoved mover, does not act in time, but he produces immaterial intelligences, which because of their imperfection can change in time. The being of existent things is inseparable from their essence. Averroes, the last of the great Islamic philosophers, lived roughly 150 years after Avicenna, his philosophical rival, and about 3 generations after Ghazali, of 1058 to 1111, the greatest of Muslim theologians. In his controversy with these two men, he concerned himself primarily with the defence and purification of Aristotle, whom he followed as closely as he could. Since he too accepted such spurious work as the theology of Aristotle, his interpretation is still permeated by Neoplatonic elements, but to a lesser extent than that of Avicenna. The success of his endeavour is indicated by the fact that he was known to scholastic writers as the commentator, and that no less a person than Thomas Aquinas had him constantly at hand as he wrote his Summa Contra Gentiles, circa 1258 to 1260, and his various commentaries upon Aristotle. The Incoherence of the Incoherence was written in reply to Ghazali's book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, a book in which Ghazali had attacked the philosophers, and in particular Avicenna, for advocating doctrines that were incompatible with their faith. As the title of his own book suggests, Averroes came to the defence of the philosophers by attacking the incoherence of the incoherence, adopting a position similar to that of the later medieval thinkers who distinguished between real and natural theology. Averroes scrupulously avoided denying any tenet of his faith. Nevertheless, he sided firmly with the philosophers. His interpretations of religious doctrines were so far removed from those of the theologians that even though he was studied carefully by Hebrew and Christian philosophers, he was not recognized to any great extent by his Islamic contemporaries. Averroes' book plays a very important role in the long controversy between the philosophers and the theologians, since it is concerned chiefly with the nature and existence of God and with the relationship between God and the cosmos. Averroes does not spell out his position in detail, for he agrees on the whole with the earlier commentators on Aristotle and with the version of Aristotle he receives from them. In particular, he agrees largely with Avicenna, disagreeing on those points, and they are important points, where he thinks Avicenna departs from Aristotle. Averroes agrees with Aristotle that there is a first cause, and he accepts a modified version of Avicenna's proof from contingency. Objects whose existence is contingent rather than necessary must have a cause. If the cause itself is contingent, and if its cause is contingent, and so on, there would be an infinite regress and therefore no cause at all. A conclusion which, it can readily be seen, denies the assumption that contingent objects must have a cause. Hence, any series of contingent objects must be preceded in existence by a necessary cause, which is either necessary through another or necessary without a cause, necessary in itself. But if we have a series of causes, each of which is necessary through another, once more we have an infinite regress and thus no cause. Hence, any series of causes necessary through another must depend upon a cause necessary in itself, a first cause. The nature of this first cause and of the way in which it causes is illuminated by Averroes' discussion of creation. Averroes agrees with the philosophers against Ghazali that the world was not created in time. The philosophers had argued that if the world was created in time, it was created directly or indirectly by God, since an infinite regress of causes is impossible. If God created it in time, then he acted at a time and therefore underwent a change in time, but unquestionably this is an impossible state of affairs since God is perfect and changeless. To Ghazali's objection that God did not act in time, but decreed from all eternity that the world should come into being at a certain time, Averroes replies that even if God had so willed from all eternity, he must also have acted at the time of creation in order to implement his decision, for every effect must have a contemporaneous cause. Consequently, the philosopher's objection cannot be avoided. It can be shown similarly that the cosmos is incorruptible, that is, that there is no time at which it will come to an end, for this too would require a change in God. Change occurs only within the world, and then only when one thing is changed into another. The world itself is eternal and everlasting. Ghazali had already attacked... Oh, this is boring stuff. Ghazali had already attacked Avicenna on this point, asserting that the followers of Aristotle now have a problem on their hands, for they must give us some account of how an eternal first cause produces things that have a beginning in time. The problem is complicated by the fact that Averroes and Avicenna agreed with Aristotle that since the world is eternal, infinite temporal sequences do occur. For instance, there was no time when the celestial sphere began to move, and no time when the first man appeared. Why not, chides Ghazali, agree with the materialists that since there is an infinite sequence of causes, a first cause is not only superfluous, but impossible? In reply, Averroes asks us to consider the case of the infinite sequence of past positions of a celestial sphere. Like Avicenna, he says that so far as the sphere is concerned, this sequence is an accidental infinite for the motion of the sphere at any given moment does not cause the motion it has at any other moment. First, if motion did cause motion, there would be an infinite regress of causes, and therefore no cause at all. Second, since motion is continuous, there are in it no discrete units that have a beginning and an end, and therefore no units that could stand in a causal relationship to one another. Finally, since the cause must be contemporaneous with the effect, the causal relation cannot span an interval of time, and past motion cannot influence present motion. In the case of the celestial sphere, the motion it has at any given moment follows not from the motion it had at some previous moment, but from its desire at that moment to emulate the perfection of the associated intelligence. Through all eternity, this intelligence has sustained it in motion from moment to moment by continually acting as its final cause. Since this intelligence is itself a being whose existence is necessary through another, we are led back to the first cause, the unmoved mover who stands behind the world. The mover itself does not operate in time, nor does it cause time directly, but it does produce an intelligence which, because it is immaterial, is changeless, but which, because it is imperfect, is able to produce change of position in the sphere, and thus to produce change in time. Averroes' treatment of the infinite sequence of man begetting man is somewhat different from the preceding argument, for in this case there are discrete objects which do not seem to cause one another successively. But here too Averroes says the sequence is in itself an accidental infinite. To be sure, the sequence does depend upon man, but only in several secondary senses. First, as he puts it, the third man can come from the second only if the first man has perished. That is, since the amount of matter in the universe is limited, human bodies can continue to come into existence only if others perish. Second, through the phenomena of conception and growth, man is the instrument by which God produces other men. But having functioned in both cases as a material cause, by providing suitable matter, man's role is complete, for nobody can produce a form in another. Directly or indirectly, the first mover is the source of the eternal form that, when individuated by matter, animates that matter. Here again, Averroes describes the mover or one of the intelligences as operating eternally as a final cause, again and again drawing forth from complexes of matter the form that is contained in them potentially. Averroes then considers the question raised by Ghazali as to how it is possible for the plurality in the world to arise from the mover, who is simple. Avicenna had argued that only one thing can emanate from God, but that this thing, the first intelligence, is able to generate more than one thing by contemplating both itself and the mover. Averroes replies first that since thought and its object are identical, the intelligence is really identical with its thought of God and with its thought of itself, and therefore that these thoughts are identical with each other. Hence there is no plurality of thought and no plurality of creation. Second, he says that when Avicenna insists that only one thing can come from God, he is thinking of the supreme intellect as if it were a finite empirical one. But this concept is a mistake. Since our intellect is limited by matter, any particular mental act can have only one object. But since God is not so limited, he can think all things even though his simplicity and changelessness preclude a plurality of acts. If it be replied that to think of all things is to have many thoughts, and that since thinker and thought are identical, God must be plural, Averroes replies that when God thinks all things, he does not think them discursively as we do. In our case, either we entertain images, a process which unquestionably involves spatial apprehension and thus spatial plurality, or we understand concepts by genus and species, a process which again introduces plurality. In either case, since we apprehend the object of thought by abstracting it from its mental context, from its material context, we apprehend it imperfectly. God, who is perfect, does not apprehend the nature of things in these ways, and therefore does not apprehend them as either individual or universal. In some manner which we do not understand, he comprehends that which is plural to us, but does not comprehend it as numerically plural. This is a particular application of the general principle that any property or capacity we attribute to God must be attributed only by analogy. God then is the source of all plurality, even though he is simple and changeless. Averroes accepts the Avicennan cosmology in its general outlines. The first mover produces a number of pure intelligences which may produce others and which cause the motions of their respective spheres, or in the case of the agent intellect, preside over generation and corruption in the sublunar world. The mover is the efficient cause of these intelligences, producing them by means of a power that it emanates, and the final and formal cause insofar as it is the thing they seek to emulate. They in turn are the efficient final and formal causes and of the motion of the spheres. Averroes agrees with Avicenna that though prime matter is not created, the existence of material things depends upon the mover, in that he is the source of the forms and also the agent, final and formal cause of the manifestation of any form in matter. But despite this disagreement, Averroes disagrees with Avicenna on a number of points, some such as the number of intelligences over 40, and the non-linear order of the intelligences. The mover may have produced all of the intelligences of the principal spheres directly, or unimportant, but others are crucial. As I've already indicated, Averroes insists that the intelligences really are simple in that they do not contemplate themselves in several essentially different ways. It follows that the spheres are not composites of soul and body, even though they are animate, and that God is the source of plurality. Consequently, God does not function as Avicenna says he does, whether by intention or not. Avicenna left the impression that God's role in the creative process was completed when he produced the first intelligence, and that further creative acts were contributed piecemeal by the various intelligences acting from their own natures. In locating the source of plurality in God, Averroes is insisting that direct responsibility for the whole creative process rests with God. It is true, he says, that the intelligences are creative agents, but they are the mover's subordinates, who out of respect for him implement his commands throughout the cosmos. Setting aside the theological analogy, we understand a theory such as this to mean that God's essence functions as the efficient, formal and final cause of the first intelligence, that this intelligence is an imperfect manifestation of the essence of God, that God as thus reflected functions once more as the efficient, formal and final cause of an intelligence or soul inferior to the first one, and so on down through the hierarchy. Averroes also differs from Avicenna in a respect which anticipates the contrast between Spinoza and Leibniz. for he loosens the Avicenna bonds of necessity. To be sure, in some sense, God does what he does necessarily, but this is not logical necessity, for the world he contemplates and thus produces is the best of all possible worlds. Similarly, the various intelligences respond to God, not because it would be contradictory not to, but because they respect him. There is a definite normative element permeating the system. On the general issue of the relation between God and the world, Averroes does not differ from Avicenna as greatly as he frequently says he does. Nevertheless, his modifications are important, and they do result in a weakening of the Neoplatonic elements, a fact that was appreciated by later Aristotelians. Another historically important feature of Averroes' philosophy is his rejection of Avicenna's sharp distinction between essence and existence. Avicenna had insisted that except in the case of God, existence is an accident that happens to an essence. For Avicenna, existence is a condition that must be satisfied by an essence before it can occur outside a mind, a property that must be added to it. Thus, the existence of a material object does not stem from its essence, but from what happened to its essence. On the other hand, Averroes insists that the very being of an existent thing is in its essence, that its being depends upon the essence, not upon what happens to the essence. For him, the term being and existence are not verb terms, but substantives applied primarily to the object itself, and secondarily to the essence that makes it the sort of thing it is. Since the object is a being or existent in virtue of its essence, it is impossible to separate essence and existence save in thought. The essence itself may be regarded as an existent in a secondary sense of that term, but in this case it is impossible to separate essence and existence, even in thought. This difference between the two men is reflected in their views inasmuch as Avicenna is very much concerned with how things come into existence, and Averroes shows himself to be more concerned with the manner in which things change. Thus, in their proofs of the existence of God, Avicenna moves from the contingent existence of things to a necessarily existent ground, whereas Averroes proceeds from the occurrence of motion to an unmoved mover. Again, whereas Avicenna's giver of forms is bringing essences into existence by impressing them upon suitably prepared matter, Averroes' agent intellect is coaxing out forms nascent in complexes of matter. Averroes insists correctly that Avicenna is moving away from Aristotle and that he himself is truer to their common master. Later, Thomas Aquinas and his followers follow Avicenna in making a sharp distinction between essence and existence, but they acknowledge Averroes' objection by transforming existence from a property into an act of being that is prior in principle to essence. On the other hand, Occam and the Averroists of the 14th, 15th, 16th and 17th centuries insist that Averroes is right and that Avicenna and Thomas are wrong. Another historically important feature of Averroes' philosophy is his disagreement with several aspects of Avicenna's psychology. First, and not so important, he believes that Avicenna added a superfluous faculty to the animal soul when he attributed an estimative sense to animals, a sense paralleling the cogitative sense in man. The ancients were correct, he says, in maintaining that an imagination can detect intentions as well as sensible forms, and that it can make judgments about these intentions. More importantly, Averroes gives a radically different account of the theoretic intellect. He agrees with Avicenna that the individual human intellect is activated only by the agent intellect, but is eternal to us and acts on all of us alike. But he disagrees about the nature of the intellect that is activated. According to Avicenna, It is the potential intellect and immaterial intellect that can survive the body. But according to Averroes, it is the passive intellect, a corporeal faculty, that cannot survive the body. Averroes does admit an immaterial potential intellect in addition to the corporeal passive intellect, but it is not a personal faculty, for it is simply the agent intellect insofar as it individuates itself when it illuminates the passive intellect in order to prepare for it the reception of intelligible forms. Averroes thinks of the immaterial soul as being individuated when it strikes a physical object. Thus there is no personal immortality, for individuality within the immaterial intellect disappears when the corporeal passive intellect dies. From the point of view of the Christian philosophers of the 12th and 13th centuries, Averroes is correct insofar as he gives the potential and agent intellects a common status, but incorrect insofar as he denies that they are personal faculties. They preferred to modify Avicenna by eliminating the 10th intelligence and endowing each human being with an individual agent intellect to accompany the individual potential intellect he already has.